In Book 4, Aristotle turns to the question of which form of government is best. He distinguishes three fundamental kinds of political organization: kingship, aristocracy, and constitutional government, or polity. The difference among these can be conceived as consisting in the number of people who have power. First, in a kingship, the power rests in the hands of a single person. In an aristocracy, the power lies in the hands of a small ruling elite. In a constitutional government, the decisions are made by the large body of the population, with some notable exceptions. Aristotle spends much of his analysis noting the different variants of these three basic forms. His goal is to determine what is ultimately the best form of government. To each of the three forms of government corresponds a negative or corrupted version. These are deviations from the correct forms of government. For kingship, the negative version is tyranny. As we've seen, this was a common term in ancient Greece, and kings were often referred to as tyrants. For aristocracy, the negative counterpart is oligarchy. Finally, Aristotle uses the word democracy in a negative sense as the corrupted version of the rule of the many. This strikes our modern ears as odd, since we tend to think of democracy as something positive. All three of the forms of government can in principle function well, provided that the people ruling are working for the good of the whole. By contrast, when they pursue their own personal interests or those of their class or group and not those of the state, then these forms of government fall into their negative version. So any form of government can be oppressive if the rulers are concerned only with their own selfish needs and advancement at the expense of the state. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong with any of the three forms of government in themselves. Aristotle continues with the same methodology that he used before in discussing human beings as, in some ways, objects of nature. Since, as we've seen, it lies in the nature of human beings to be social creatures, cities are natural growths. It follows from this that the different kinds of political arrangements are also developments from nature. Aristotle thus regularly draws analogies between the natural world and the political one. For example, we read, quote, "But there are held to be two sorts of regimes particularly, just as in the case of winds, some are called northern and others southern, and others deviations from these. So many hold that there are two sorts of regimes, ruled by the people and oligarchy," end quote. Among Aristotle's scientific works appears On the Parts of Animals, a work of zoology in which he describes how the different limbs, organs, and systems of animal life are arranged in different ways in order to produce the many different forms that appear in the animal kingdom. While all animals have some form of mouth, stomach, and sense organs, these can differ radically in their actual forms and sizes. He now draws an analogy to this in his political philosophy. A state also consists of many different parts which can take many different forms and be arranged in many different ways. Just as the specific nature and arrangement of the different organs determine what kind of an animal it is, so also the nature and arrangement of the different parts of the state determine what kind of a state it is. Aristotle recognizes that it's not just the numerical aspect of who rules that's important. That is, the one in the kingship, the few in aristocracy, or the many in constitutional government. He also points out that differing degrees of wealth add an important dimension to the political equation. Oligarchy tends to consist of rich people who are members of the aristocracy. By contrast, a large number of people in a democracy will almost inevitably be poor. He therefore revises his definition of the basic categories of government with this addition as follows, quote, "Democracy exists when the free and the poor, being a majority, have authority to rule. Oligarchy when the wealthy and better born have authority and are few." Now, just as there can be different variations on the basic concept of democracy, so also there are different forms of kingship and oligarchy. The goal of political science is to explore these different forms and evaluate their respective advantages and disadvantages.